Hi, everyone. Happy Monday. Thank you for joining me for Reimagining Education, Conversations on Character and the Common Good. This series is part of the Virtues and Vocations initiative, which seeks to make character, purpose, and meaning central to education and pre-professional and professional education in particular. This initiative is a collaboration between Notre Dame and Duke University. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Center for Social Concerns here at Notre Dame. Brief note on logistics. We're going to have a conversation with today's speaker for about 40 minutes, and then we will open it up to Q&A through the Q&A mechanism. So please post your questions there. And with that, I couldn't be more delighted to introduce Mary Gentile on giving voice to values. Professor Mary Gentile is the creator and developer of Giving Voice to Values, which was launched with the Aspen Institute and Yale School of Management and hosted at Babson College for 6 years. It is now based at UVA Darden. This pioneering curriculum for values-driven leadership has been piloted and/or presented in over 1,300 sites globally. Yep, that's 1,300 sites, and has been featured in a number of publications, including the Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, Stanford Innovation Review, and McKinsey Quarterly. Gentile is the Richard M. Waitzer Bicentennial Professor of Ethics at UVA Darden and is an educational consultant. She was previously at Harvard Business School. She holds a BA from the College of William and Mary and a PhD from State University of New York, Buffalo. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Suzanne.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see you. So I think as we discussed, we're going to proceed in 3 different ways with today's conversation. I think the first piece I'm hoping we can talk about is really your core argument and the structure of your curriculum, Giving Voice to Values, as it was in 2010 and how it might have evolved since then. I think this work is one that lots and lots and lots of people have heard of, although they might not have explored it in depth. So I'm hoping to start with some basics. Then consider how your work may inform both individual behavior and collective culture in workplaces, schools, etc. And then finally reflect on how you are adapting this work to other professions, engineering, etc., and any other more general thoughts you might have for educators. So that's the game plan.
Sounds good.
Well, good. So as I said, giving voice to values is a bit of a phenomenon. I confess, book came out in 2010, heard lots and lots about it. It was one of those books I thought I could cite without ever having opened. It was so everywhere in this really fabulous way, but became really familiar with it about 3 years ago as part of a project at Duke looking at questions of sexual misconduct with a group of students. And it really became this treasured resource for the group. So I would love if you can bring us back what is now 12 years with the original inspiration for the book, where the idea came from, but also the moment it came into public consciousness with the inauguration of Obama. So yeah. Time travel a little bit, if you will.
Sure. So I'll begin to tell you the story, and feel free to interrupt me if you want me to elaborate in different directions. But it really, Giving Voice to Values, or GVV as I refer to it, it really kind of grew out of my experiences well before the book came out. I had been working in business schools, 10 years at Harvard and 5 years at Babson College, and now 6 years at Darden. I'd been working at business schools. I'd also been consulting to business schools around the world and companies around issues of ethics and values and responsibility. And I was frustrated, disillusioned, despairing in the way we tended to address these issues. And it's not blaming anyone else. It was the way I addressed them too. But we tended to approach them as if they were entirely cognitive, as if they were entirely intellectual challenges. And I can't tell you how many times we would sit around tables and say, we just need a decision-making framework. and it was like we wanted a black box where you could put all the information in one end, and then the ethical answer would come out the other end, and then you were done. And, I became discouraged with this because it was sort of, I call it the preach and pretend method. We preach to you about what's right, and then we pretend you can do it, and so at one level I was discouraged because I felt like this wasn't really working. I also realized that what I saw in the classroom was sometimes, disturbingly counter to what we intended, because we would present ethical dilemmas, these thorny ethical dilemmas, and then students would practice even using models of ethical reasoning, from philosophy, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics. They'd practice ways of basically rationalizing anything. I kind of called it a schooling for sophistry, because, these models of ethical reasoning are extremely valuable in helping you think rigorously and consistently, but they don't tell you what's right. By definition, by design, they conflict. That's why they're useful. And so I was realizing that this, at this sort of experiential and intellectual level, I was realizing this isn't working. But it was also a personal level, because I see myself as something of an introvert, despite the fact that I spend all my time giving talks now. And I also saw myself as somewhat risk averse, not somebody who sought out arguments. I perceived ethical behavior as something that required moral courage. It required, speaking truth to power. And I kind of thought, well, gee, that's great, but, I don't think I can do that. And I started to think, I'll bet a lot of other people feel that way too, and so I was frustrated. I felt that what we were doing wasn't working. And so I started and so I took a step back from all this work. I was doing other things, but I started to find research and also have experiences that led me to think that maybe we needed a different approach. There's been a lot of research in recent years in behavioral ethics and behavioral psychology, in social psychology, even in the neurosciences, that suggests that if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, that literally rehearsal practice is a very effective way of doing that. There's a lot of work about how we have a more intuitionist approach to ethical choices, that we tend to react emotionally and then rationalize post hoc why something was the right thing, or even just the only thing you could do. And so I felt like, gee, we don't get over that. If you just ask people, what would you do? You're going to trigger that automatic response, and people are going to answer in terms of what they think is possible, because they want to avoid that cognitive dissonance that comes from knowing something's wrong and doing it anyways. And so I didn't think that was working. And when I started to come across research that was suggesting that there was this power in rehearsal and practice, it sort of began to be the seeds of GVV. I'll tell you two short stories because I think they kind of illustrate it. One was I came across some research about rescuers from World War II. These are people who put their lives at stake during World War II to help folks who were the victims of the Holocaust. And there were several scholars who wanted to understand, why did these people do this when so many people, presumably who didn't all agree with what was going on, didn't act? And so they found a group of rescuers through two different studies, and they interviewed them in depth, and they found a number of characteristics they tended to share. But the one that really resonated with me is that they all talked about, at an earlier point in their lives, usually as young adults, they'd had the experience of rehearsing out loud to someone more senior to them. So a teacher or a boss or even a parent, rehearsing out loud, what would you do if, and then various moral conflicts. And so of course they couldn't have anticipated the Holocaust, but they had this idea of literally naming the values that mattered to them, putting words to them, a kind of articulation, a script, and then actually voicing them out loud to this person more senior to them, who kind of stood in as proxy for the kind of person they might need to speak with in the actual circumstances. And so that was interesting to me. It sort of triggered this idea. And then I started finding research in psychology, folks who study positive deviance, folks who study habit formation, neurosciences where they look about creating new neural pathways, and it all suggesting this idea of rehearsal and practice. But the other story was much more personal. When I was still working at Harvard Business School, I decided to take a self-defense class. And I looked around Boston. There were a lot of these classes. They all teach pretty much the same things. They teach you the physical moves, to defend yourself. But there was one class that was different. It was called model mugging. And it was a developmental model. So they would still teach you the physical moves, fist to bridge of nose and heel to instep. And you'd practice these in the air. But then in this class, once you knew the moves, they'd bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, sort of like the Michelin Man. And then they would have us all line up and take turns getting attacked to full force by this gentleman. And you could use the moves you just learned on him full force because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was kind of ridiculous. You just stood there waiting your turn to get attacked, But as the class went on, week after week, I'd be talking to someone over here. He would come and grab me from the other direction, and I never knew when. I never knew what hold he was going to use. So it was nerve-wracking, but they explained to us that it was based on this research from the field of kinesthetics. So athletes would be familiar with this, but it's called specific state muscle memory. So it's this idea that if you rehearse something in the same physiological and cognitive and emotional state that you'll be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze in the moment, your body remembers. The athlete will practice and practice, and when they're at tournament under stress, their body assumes the proper form. And so I'm in this class and I'm laying on my back because I've failed to protect myself. And I'm thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory, a kind of default to voice, but not just to speaking up? Because the other thing I was learning from gathering many, many stories and interviewing people is that the people who did this effectively, it was not typically a matter of going to their boss and telling him or her that they were evil. It was much more tactical and nuanced and strategic. And so it's more of a default to informed voice. And so that was kind of the idea here, to create this moral muscle memory through rehearsal and practice. And when I looked at what we did in teaching, that's not what we did. What we would do is focus as if it was all about figuring out what's right. And that's important. And it's not always easy. But there's a lot of times when people do know what they think is right, but they don't think it's possible. And that's where this GVV approach, I think, is helpful. And the other thing that I would just say is that I think that when we don't think something is possible, we start to think the issues are grayer than they are, because it's self-protective. I remember working with a gentleman who worked at West Point. He was in charge of the Center for Ethical Leadership in the U.S. Army. He would design all the training for the 1.3 million civilian and enlisted, not just him alone, him and his team. And he was telling me that he'd been working in this field for years, and he said that over the years, it seemed like there were so many more gray issues that people thought were gray. But we talked about it and realized that it wasn't just that there were more gray issues. Obviously, there are some, we have different world, but a lot of it was also this sense of not having the capacity to act. And so those were some of the ideas that kind of triggered this. I'm going to pause because I'm not sure if I answered all your questions.
No, that was fantastic. And this notion of moral muscle memory was one that I really wanted to hit on, because in the book, you talk about distinguishing values from ethics. And yet, in some ways, the voicing of values is a moral proposition, right? And so could you just, for us, clarify how you're distinguishing ethics from values?
Yeah. So some of it's a rhetorical thing, but what I was recognizing, this was primarily working with MBA students, but now I see it also in businesses and other professions, et cetera, is that ethics is usually seen as a code of ethics, right? It's something outside you. It's a set of rules. It's a set of principles. It might be, your company's code of ethics. It might be your professions, if you're a physician or a lawyer or a journalist, code of ethics. And what I really wanted to do with GVV is actually connect with something more aspirational and more internal to the individual actors. And values are something that we hold, right? And we also know from the research that although, of course, there are cultural differences, that there tend to be a core set of values, the philosophers call them hypernorms, that are pretty universally shared among human beings, barring, psychological real troubles, and so, there's a good idea here to think about the values that are shared. And it's great that there's a common ground. It's also true that it's a very short list, and it's a very high level list. And so what I wanted to do was to help people to think about, when you confront a values conflict, what is the value that's at play here? Does it rise to the level of those kinds of hypernorms, that are shared? And if it does, can you frame your approach to it in a language that is likely to appeal to the value that the people you're speaking to also share? In other words, don't talk about it in terms of your own politics or your own religion or your own, cultural background, whatever that may be. Try and find a language that will connect with the individuals that you're trying to influence or to negotiate with, whatever the issue is. And so I use values because I don't want it to be about thou shalt not. I want it to be about can do. Because I was working with business school students, but I see this more broadly, is that, these are people who are not attracted to constraints on action. They're people who actually want to achieve things, build enterprises, make money, succeed in their careers, build new products, whatever it might be. And so, trying to help them take a more entrepreneurial approach to ethics, to realize that, this is about helping you be the person you actually want to be. That tends to appeal to them more, and it tends to get them more engaged.
Great. So I love the approach to sort of investing in agency in the actors in this, which I think is such a critical dimension of what you're doing. I guess I have one question, and then a couple of follow-ups as you talk. Do we know what values we want to speak out on? And are we good at noticing and understanding when our values have been transgressed?
Right.
I'm thinking back to your sort of self-defense class, and I love this notion of muscle memory, but where does the insecurity and the panic of that moment enter? And to what extent do we need to do value elicitation to understand what our values are, and then understand how they may or may not be consistent with an environment or a situation we find ourselves in?
Right. That's important. Well, so, I think the way we typically were approaching ethics, and this was not my taxonomy or characterization, a lot of people speak about it, but I know we talked about it at HBS, for example, is that we were trying to build awareness so that people would recognize values conflicts that might come up, especially if you're working in new fields, technology, for example. I'm working right now in a multi-school project with Deloitte, where we're looking at tech ethics questions, STEM ethics questions. And there's a lot of stuff that's new because we can do stuff we couldn't do before, So building awareness so that you recognize the issues. That's also true when you're working globally. And then once you've recognized them, analysis. And that's where, all those models of ethical reasoning, but it's also regulations and corporate codes of conduct and things like that come into play. And those are important, but we would stop there. And so GVV is not about replacing those. It's about adding on the third A, or action. It's about, once you have determined these issues, then how do you act on it? And so I think that's one piece of it. But the other piece of it is that I think we learn not to see the issues, and so I think when people feel empowered, they actually recognize issues that they were before. As I was explaining, there's a kind of unconscious, automatic psychological process that allows you not to see them, to sort of rationalize that they're not really that big a deal, or they're not really a problem. And so I think the other thing is simply going to action and giving people scenarios. And as I usually explain to people, a GVV case or scenario is post-decision making. So the protagonist in the case has already decided what they think is right. So giving them that example and having them rehearse how to act on it, it's starting to build that ability to recognize issues, because you're starting to feel empowered. You're starting to feel as if you have efficacy. And so there's two answers to your question. I mean, one is, yes, we should build awareness and analysis, but the other is, if you start focusing on action, you're going to actually make all your efforts to build awareness and analysis go much further.
Great. Is your sense that there are particular situations? So is there, again, the self-defense class? So you're practicing with the Michelin Man, and you're practicing this in the context of programs and education. What's hardest about this in developing the muscle memory for people and the ability to both understand where they're in a situation where there's a values conflict and to feel fully comfortable acting on it? And are there things about individuals or situations that make that more or less challenging?
Well, I guess go ahead.
No, go on.
I guess there's there's a number of different ways to answer that. There's some general things that make it hard, and there are some situational factors that make it harder. I mean, the situational factors are not things that would surprise you. I mean, obviously, it can be challenging when you're new in a situation. It can be challenging when you are lower on the hierarchy in a situation. It can be challenging if you feel that you don't have the expertise. It can be challenging if you are in the minority in some way, demographically, for example, or even in terms of background. You're the only non-lawyer in the group or something, you know. So those sort of situational things, I think we're aware of. People study those. But I think there's some other things that just make it challenging to do this, and that's what so much of the behavioral ethics research has looked at, you know, in terms of people's concern about somehow being, maybe they were part of the group, but concerned about somehow being ostracized, somehow being seen as not part of the team, somehow being perceived as not willing to go the extra mile, not being willing to do what it takes to get something done. There's all kinds of sort of cultural frames for the way we look at going along to get along. And a lot of them make it feel that if you stand up, you're being a jerk, you're being counterproductive. Some of that is because I think we often tend to view giving voice to values in terms of whistleblowing. We often tend to think of it in terms of, the person who, shakes their fist and stamps their foot and, tells someone that they're evil. And what I found when I gathered stories about people who did this effectively is that's not typically how they did it. I mean, there are times when whistleblowing is of course necessary. Stakes are so high, lives are at stake, time is really short, but this is not what GVV is about. GVV is about actually helping people engage in this kind of conversation much before whistleblowing would be required. It's about changing the nature of the conversation within the organization. And I wanted to do that for a couple of reasons. One, because most of the research talks about how costly whistleblowing is for the whistleblower, for the organization, for the victims of whatever practice the whistle was being blown on. It's like the horse is already out of the barn when you get to that point, And so what I really wanted to do was to help people to be able to have these conversations earlier on so that decisions and practices were developed before it got to that point. And I think that's part of why it's been attractive to organizations, even though I really was thinking it was just going to be useful for educational purposes and specifically MBA education. But a lot of companies have approached me about it because I think they see it as so useful for any kind of leadership development, because, it's about being able to communicate about things that aren't easy to communicate about, and so I think that's part of it. And the other thing is that we don't have practice doing it. We think of it as an exception. And often when you're in a situation and you do recognize that there's a problem, the tendency is to kind of close your eyes tight and just get through it, so that you can get back to work. And what I was learning from talking to people is that part of what makes this doable is when you frame it as normal, when you frame it as a normal part of life, a normal part of business. I mean, really, if we think about it, we encounter some kind of values conflicts every day, with a spouse or a friend or our business colleagues. And so if we see them as exceptional, we sort of dumb ourselves down. We sort of limit our options. But if we see them as normal and we bring the stress down, all the research on creativity suggests that people are more innovative and creative when they don't feel pressured. And so that's part of it too. So by doing this kind of rehearsal and practice, the idea is that we're normalizing it, I actually I'll share a story. I got that idea from one of the people I interviewed. I was interviewing a guy. He worked with a company that was involved with acquiring a lot of other companies. And his job was usually to do the negotiations with the senior leadership of the firms that were being acquired. And he told me this story. He said that he was having, it was the end of a process. It had been like a year-long process, this acquisition. They were close to sealing the deal. And he was having a couple of days of meeting with the CEO and CFO of the company that was being acquired. And they'd finished their meetings and they were at the airport and they were having a glass of wine before they all flew off in other directions. And the CEO and the CFO turned to him and said, so, tell us the truth, what's really going to happen to us when this all goes through, And this guy I was talking to, he said to me, I'm not supposed to say anything about that, And he said, but on the other hand, he said, I didn't want to screw up the deal. And also I'd become friends with these guys. I respected them, and he said, I didn't want to just lie to them. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, Mary, I lied. And then he paused and he said, instinctively, I lied. And he said, but then I went home and I thought about it. And I thought, if I keep doing this kind of work, and he said, and I really like this work. He said, this is going to happen in every deal. He said, it's always going to happen. I'm going to face this. And so I can either just lie every time, or I can take an hour or two and sit down and think about what's something I can say in these sort of situations that respects my confidentiality responsibilities that I have to my employer, but is also honest and is also substantive to the recipient. And he said, so he kind of came up with a little script, with something like, well, even if I knew the answer to that, I couldn't say anything, but what I can tell you is, and then he said, these are the things that I recommend that you do that will put you in the best situation. And he tried to have some substantive suggestions. And he said, I use that now, he said, because I realized this is going to come up every time. It's a normal part of business. It's not an exception. And so why don't I treat it as something that I can learn to do better? And he said, people aren't thrilled that that's all the information I'll give them, but they respect it. And they appreciate that I've actually thought about giving them some substantive input, and rather than just trying to get through the moment. And so that was sort of an insight for me. It's like, let's normalize this rather than seeing it as the big exception, because it isn't,
That's great. As you tell that story, I'm wondering about the sort of the giving voice to values as an approach to value conflict. What about routine value affirmation? So if we are voicing values at a moment of conflict, should we also be thinking about voicing and affirming and reinforcing values on somewhat of a day-to-day basis, so the values conversation is part of the ether when challenges emerge or not?
Yeah, well, the short answer is, excuse me, the short answer is yes. But one of the things I like to suggest when I'm working with companies is that, of course, we'll do training and I'll work with them on figuring out how to do that. But then also, if you're a manager, if you have a team, no matter what level you're at, or even if you're just an individual contributor, when you're facing any kind of decision, to frame it as the GVV thought experiment. In our work, we call it the Giving Voice to Values thought experiment, when we say, what if you wanted to do X? And it's, the ethical thing, the right thing, rather than what can we do? Or, that kind of thing, how do we get as close to the line as, And so, you know, as a manager or as a colleague, if you kind of frame everything as the thought experiment where it's, you know, how can we do X when X is both, you know, economically feasible and successful for the firm, but also operating within the organizations and the individual's values. So framing your challenges not as how do we get as close as we can to the line, but rather how can we be as effective as possible and also respect our values. And so that's kind of an everyday kind of way of reframing your challenges. The example I give for education is that I remember before I developed GVV, I would often be working with faculty who were trying to address issues of sustainability and environmental issues into their business courses. I'm sorry, I have a frog in my throat. And so they would usually set up some kind of debate, you know, where they would have, you know, one group of the students on the side of, we're going to try and operate in an environmentally respectful way, and the other group saying we can't do that because it's too expensive or whatever it would be. And so they would set it up as this debate, and it was, to me, often a false dichotomy, but it actually suggested an equivalency, and also it suggested that there were no other options. And so what I wanted to do was to suggest, can we, rather than framing it that way, can we frame it, how can we be, you know, economically successful and environmentally responsible? And so it's the same kind of thing, you know, in an educational setting, trying to avoid the false dichotomy, in a corporate setting, trying to engage people on a regular basis with this kind of problem solving with the thought experiment.
Great. So this has been a program you've shared globally, and you describe a set of hypernorms which are universal. Are there places where you felt this was culturally more challenging to engage, or does it seem to really be pinging on that universal?
It's so interesting. When I first created this, faculty in the US and in perhaps Western Europe were saying to me, well, Mary, this is interesting and it might work here, but it will never work in, and then you fill in the blank. It'll never work in China. It'll never work in India. It'll never work in Russia or the Middle East or Africa or South America. And, you know, I've now worked in all those places, you know, but I thought, well, they might be right. You know, well, here I am, Mary Gentile in Boston. What do I know? You know, it may not work. But I started getting invited to all those places. And so I took it and I approached it as an experiment, you know, will this be useful to you? And it's been really interesting to me, the responses I've gotten in those places, very welcoming, and actually in some cases, less combative than I've gotten in the US and Western Europe in a more traditionally sort of market-driven shareholder value maximization kind of capitalist system. But there have been challenges, and I actually learned I had to do like 5 things to get people to hear me when I was in those contexts. I'll share a story. The first time I took this, or one of the first times I took this to India, I was invited to go and do a 2-day program in Bangalore and a 2-day program in Delhi for entrepreneurs. It was something called the National Entrepreneurship Network of India. And so in each group, it was about 30 or 35 faculty who taught entrepreneurship and young entrepreneurs in India. And I remember the same thing kind of happened in each place. So I remember the first day walking in, and there's a room full of these individuals, and they were all sitting with their arms crossed, leaning back in their chairs, their heads cocked, looking kind of skeptical, you know. And I thought, oh no. So I said, okay, guys, what's up? You know, what's going on? And they didn't say anything at first, but then finally one individual, you know, bravely spoke up and said, well, madam, we're delighted you're here. And we're very happy to listen to you talk about giving voice to values. But you have to understand, this is India and we're entrepreneurs. And we can't even get a driver's license without paying a bribe. So this really isn't going to be relevant to us. But we're happy to listen to you, madam, and we're delightful that you're here. We're delighted you're here. So I thought, well, good. I'm glad they were honest, you know. So I ended up doing 5 things. The first thing you have to do, I found, is I had to acknowledge the reality of the context. So the first thing I said was, well, look, you know, this is not my first trip to India. This is my 10th trip to India. I know what you're talking about is real, I believe you. I've experienced it myself, not for driver's licenses, but other things. So you acknowledge the reality of the context. And then the second thing you do is you say, but nevertheless, I know you have values. I'm not here to tell you what your values should be. I know you have them. I know you're not always thrilled to pay a bribe. I had friends in India who would regale me with stories of, being how frustrating it was to be stopped by a cop who demanded a bribe in order to not give them a ticket for something they weren't doing anyways, and then they would, some of them had ideas about how they would get out of it. And others of them would say, I just paid the bribe because I needed to go pick up my kids at school, or, whatever it was. So I said, I know you have values. I know that, but because of the reality of the context you just described, it's not always easy to act on them. So this is really not about telling you what your values should be. It's about actually helping you act on the values you have, because I know you'd like to in a lot of circumstances. So that helps. And then the third thing you do is you explain what I already just explained to you, which is the GVB thought experiment. Then I'm not going to ask you, what would you do? Because I know that would trigger all those emotional defensive responses. I'm just going to ask you, what if you wanted to do this? How could you get it done? And that tends to bring the stress down in the room. And then the fourth thing is I always try and have an example of someone from that country, region, culture, whatever it is, who has done this, And so I happened in that case to have a story that I'd worked on with the Carnegie Council. It was an Indian entrepreneur who had acquired a company from one of the major multinationals. And when he acquired it, it was near bankruptcy. It was hugely corrupt. It was in violation even of the Indian labor laws. It was in bad shape. And in the space of a couple of years, he turned it around, both financially, but also it became a model of clean operations. So I had these videos of him sharing scenarios of challenges he'd faced, like pressures by the state employees to pay bribes in order to get approvals and things, and how he'd not done it and what he did. And so that does a couple things, because it triggers a sense of pride, somebody from here did this, and it also triggered a sense of competitiveness, if he can do it, I can do it. So that helps. And then the last thing I do is I always have to explain that voice in giving voice to values is a metaphor. It doesn't mean going to your boss and yelling at him or her, It might mean asking a question. It might mean doing some research. It might mean writing a memo. It might mean talking to someone who talks to someone who talks to the decision maker. And that's hugely important, especially in a culture where there's very high authority hierarchies, but it's useful everywhere. And so when I do those 5 things, people tend to get engaged. And this group, in fact, that I was telling you about, they got very engaged. They sort of were lapsing into speaking Hindi when they were discussing the cases. Unfortunately, I'd had a friend co-teach with me who is Indian, and she would be whispering in my ear what they were saying, but they get really engaged because I think there's a sense of possibility, I had a similar experience in Shanghai, I had a really similar experience in Moscow. So, you have to acknowledge their truth and start from a position of respect, but that doesn't mean that you're saying what's good in Rome is good. It's not that you're saying values don't matter. It's simply you're saying, I know that acting on your values is going to be more difficult or just different because of this, and I want to help you get better at it.
That's great. I really appreciate that specific example of work in India. The social scientist in me is begging to ask, in all of these conversations, are you somehow tracking the responses, and how do you engage with follow-up to no impact? Or is right, like, that's probably several other human beings' work, given all that you've already been doing. But I'm just dying to know, sort of, right, would you be able to say, like, it's resonated best in the following context, and here's where it's been stickiest, or not? Is that just beyond the scope?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I have a couple of different ways I think about that. One is I am not a social scientist, so I don't feel like I'm equipped to do that kind of research, but there are folks who I've worked with who are starting to do that kind of research. And so there's a couple things in terms of me personally, why I feel that it's having an impact is number one, it was based on empirical research. It was based on empirical research, not about GVV, but about how you influence behavior. And so that gave me a good foundation. That's why I built it, you know. But then the second thing is that I started to get, what do you call it, anecdotal information, where people would tell me stories about what had happened when they used it. And then the third is the kinds of people who come back and ask for this. So for example, in business education, one of the fields that has been most interested in this is accounting, which I think is really interesting. And there have been a number of textbooks that have built it in. There have been a lot of courses. I'll tell you a story in a minute that came from accounting. And they have begun to do some empirical research, you know, working with their students pre and post and looking at some of the impacts. And in fact, there are some studies that have been published on that. And then in companies, you know, they'll usually not want to do, you know, academic research because it's all internal and all of that, but they will do surveys and things. So, you know, companies will, I've been working with Lockheed Martin, for example, for about 10 years. They were the first company to approach me and say, can we try this here? And they built some questions into their regular, I think it's every 2 years, employee survey. And they were specifically about this. And what they're seeing, they think, is that they're getting, not only are people raising issues or acknowledging that there are issues more, but they're more often saying that I found a way to handle it myself. And so in other words, it's not that they're not bringing issues to the compliance officers, because they kind of want to know about that stuff, but they're sometimes bringing it to them and saying, I'd like to address this, but will you work with me to create a script and action plan? Whereas in the past, they might just bring it to the compliance officer and dump it in their laps and say, you handle it, which would trigger investigations and would become a much more official kind of bureaucratic process. They're a government contractor, so they have to investigate these things. But what they're finding is that people are figuring out how to begin to address them before they get to that point, you know, which is exactly what you want. It's more culture change. So they're beginning to gather that kind of data. There is one story I'll share. It's not really empirical research or data, but it's interesting. Is there's a couple of accounting faculty in the US, and they, you know, a number of years ago, after some of the big scandals, the rules became that if, in order to get to be a certified public accountant, you had to take an ethics accounting class in your educational experience, and then they have to have continuing ed. And so these faculty were teaching undergraduate accounting majors, and they had been teaching them accounting ethics sophomore year when they declare their major, junior year and senior year. And then in the senior year, they would give them an exercise where they said, do this problem set. It wasn't an ethical issue. Do this problem set and submit your answer at this website. And then after you've submitted your answer, go to this other website, and there's some more information that will affect this, but don't look at that one until you've submitted your first answer. Well, after 3 years of teaching about ethics, they all went, almost all of them went to the other site first, you know, before they submitted their answer. And these faculty were really discouraged because they'd really tried in good faith, you know, to do this. And that's when I met them and told them about GVV. And so they agreed to experiment with it. So they built GVV into the next cohorts, sophomore year, junior year, senior year. When they did the same exercise, nobody went to the second website before they handed in their answers. Now, you can't say it's causal, you know, but it's interesting, you know. And so those are the kinds of things that I tend to find. It's really hard to do a study that's causal because you want time distance, you know, and also because I really feel, and I tell this to companies I work with, that this isn't a one-time training. You're trying to change the way people speak in the organization, change the way people make decisions, change the way people interact. And so it's something that you have to revisit. It has to be normalized, you know. But there are people who are beginning to do more of the kind of research I think that you're asking about. I'm not doing that research.
Great. So I thank you. I really appreciate the stories on it. So the questions are queuing up, so I'm going to throw the first one out if you don't mind. So you mentioned that you've done a lot of business consulting around GVV, and you mentioned that sometimes the pushback in the US is greater than in other countries. What do you see as the biggest challenges to getting GVV norms into corporate cultural practices these days in the US? So what are the Yeah, what are the barriers to this kind of work?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say is I'm not sure that it'd be fair to say it's greater, but I just don't think it's fair to say that it's easier. I think there's challenges in both in the West, and there's challenges in other parts of the world, and they're somewhat different. But I think often we act as if, it's going to be so easy here because people aren't going to be afraid to talk to their bosses or something. And that's not true. So that was the first thing I wanted to just, clarify. I hadn't been quite clear on that. In terms of what the biggest challenges are, I think it's just really human nature. I mean, I think it's really, people are afraid that acting this way is going to lead them to be, it's either at a very personal level going to lead them to be less successful, but also just the experiential part of it. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to make it hard to be with their colleagues. They're going to be seen as goody two shoes, or, not naive, in terms of the way they do things. I like to tell the story that I remember when I was teaching at HBS and other business schools as well, and people would talk about these issues, and students would often say, this is really too hard for someone who's new in an organization. You don't have relationships, you don't have any real authority, positional authority, you don't have credibility yet, you don't have your network built up. It's really risky. If you were more senior, when you get to be CEO, then you can act on your values. They would say that, and I was always thinking, well, if you wait till you're CEO, you're not going to be the kind of person anymore who would act on your values. But, and also what I thought was intriguing is that they all assumed they were going to be CEO, but nevertheless, so it's too risky when you're very junior. But then I would be in, I've done a lot of work with the Aspen Institute, and we'll do dialogues and bring folks together at very high levels. And there would be people in those kind of high level dialogues who would be talking, saying, look, of course I want to act on my values, but you got to understand, at my level, it's very difficult. It's very risky because I have all these people who rely on me, investors, of course, but my employees, my community, my customers, my colleagues. It's really challenging when you have all those different stakeholders relying on you. If I were lower in the organization, it'd be easier. And then you talk to people in the middle, and they talk about being squeezed from both sides. Now, the fact is, these are all true. None of these people are making this up. They're not just making excuses. You got to respect them. Those are true things. But the fact also is that we find people at every level who do this. They just do it very differently because they have different levers they can pull. They have different degrees of freedom. So in the GVV curricular materials, for example, we intentionally have stories of people who are very new in their roles, as well as people who are very senior. And you'll see that they do have different leverage, different things that they can try and do because of that, and different constraints as well. So I think to say what's the hardest thing, it really, it's all challenging, but it's challenging in different ways. And so I think part of what we have to figure out is, where you are and what are the things that you need to be able to do. And in fact, that's one of the pillars of GVV, is what I call self-knowledge and alignment, where you understand what your own personal gifts are, what your own personal strengths are, what your own personal comfort level is, how you've been effective in the past, even if it wasn't on an ethical issue, so that you can frame the issue you face in a way that plays to your strengths, rather than asking the introvert to be, aggressive, or asking the extrovert to be cautious. You have to play to your strengths, and that means framing the challenge differently.
Great. Next question, and it's a long one. Thanks for the session. I think some of the most serious ethical failures in business recently have come about because leaders were too resolute about their values, and their values were in fact wrong. I think about the value affirming mediations Elizabeth Holmes would do each morning to prepare to stand up for her faith in the medical testing technology. How much time should a leader spend discerning whether they have the right values based in good reasons with respect to risk, the common good, fair play, et cetera, versus preparing themselves to articulate and promote those values in the face of challenges. And are there instances from your research where individuals used this method to give voice to values we would now view as unethical? Well, that's a doozy.
That's a big question. Yeah. Well, so I have a couple thoughts. I'm not sure if I'll be able to cover all the angles of that question. So when I first was creating GVV, I had this fear. You've probably figured out anyone who would create GVV is kind of an earnest person, and I am. and I used to lie in bed at night thinking, can I release this into the world or not? Because what if I'm teaching people to be able to act on their values and they have bad values? Right? So I worried about this. But then in the end, what I realized is that, or what I concluded, I could be wrong, but I don't think so. What I concluded is that we already, in the way we teach about these issues, are framing it in a way that makes it easier for people who have bad values to find ways to justify them, as I was saying earlier in our conversation. And that what we're not doing is giving people who are wanting to do something that truly is responsible, ethical, values driven in a positive sense, but still difficult. We're not giving them the opportunity to build that skill and to look at lots of models of people who've done that and what works for them, not just to be inspired by role models, but to actually look tactically. What did they do? How did they reframe the challenge so that the person they needed to influence would come along? Again, remember, this is short of whistleblowing. And so, what did they do to move their organization, to get them engaged? How did they manage to not give in to the unethical pressures and still kept their jobs and still were relatively successful, So that was what enabled me to get around that concern, which I think is part of what the questioner was asking at the end. But then to go back to, I think, the earlier part of the question about, what leaders should do for their own sort of self-insight. I remember earlier in my career, even when I was just beginning to create GVV, I did a 1-week course on management by human values in Calcutta. And it was really interesting because they would start each day with meditation. And what was interesting to me is I was there were like 60 people in the class, and they were almost all middle and senior level managers in India, pretty much all men. And I was like one of the 2 or 3 women and one of the only non-Indians in the room. And it was interesting because it was clear that meditation was a common practice for them, the folks in the room anyways, maybe the kinds of ones who would take this course. But, I do think that some level of self-reflective practice is a very good thing for everyone, but yes, if you are a senior leader, but I don't think that ensures that you're going to do the right thing. I mean, I've read a little bit about Elizabeth Holmes, and, it seemed that she was very influenced by another person in her life, let's just put it that way. And that a lot of what her efforts were to try and do what she thought would be appropriate in his eyes. And so I don't think that we should necessarily see people like that as the models for what we should do or what we shouldn't do. I think that everyone has their own unique psychological makeup, and there are some things going on there, right? And so what I'm trying to do is to think more about, the general folks that we deal with, not people who are at the very different extremes. In fact, one of the things I talk about in the work I do is that I think about GVV as not a course for people who are going to get in trouble. It used to be I would get invited to companies or to speak places, and they would say, well, most of the students here, most of the managers here are good people. We just got a few bad apples, and they're the ones that this is for. But I actually think of the audience differently, and this is based on some research by Greg Dees and Peter Crampton. But I think about the audience as a bell curve. And what we premise is that at one tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as opportunists, people who would say, I'm going to try and do what's going to maximize my self-interest. regardless of values. Now, nobody falls into one category all the time, but people who say that's their major motivation. And at the other tail end of the bell curve are the folks who self-identify as idealists, people who say, I will always try and act on my values, regardless of the impact on my self-interest. I sort of premise that we're really talking about the folks under the bell. I put myself there. We call them pragmatists, and we call pragmatists people who would say, I would like to act on my values as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll succeed. It's not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll never pay a price. It simply means I think I have a shot. Now, if you think of it that way, I don't really think I have the power to change the opportunists, as in the question. I mean, I think, those folks are always going to be with us for a variety of reasons. Some of them because of their own weakness and some of them because of their own strength in a negative direction, but they'll always be there. And I don't really worry as much about the idealists, except I want them to be more skillful. But we're really focusing on the pragmatists and saying, we want to give you the skills and the literal scripts and the positive examples, the action plans, the rehearsal to be who you already want to be at your best. So we're not trying to change you, we're trying to enable you, to empower you. And our premise is that if enough of those pragmatists and idealists become more skillful at this, develop that moral muscle memory, it changes the water that the opportunists are swimming in. So the calculus that they do to determine what's in their self-interest has got to change because they can't rely on the same level of silent complicity. And, in the case, the example that was being given, obviously in the end, there were whistleblowers, but just think about if there'd been more effective voices raised much earlier on. So, I mean, in the end, it was a pretty horrible experience for many. But, that's what this is about, is trying to change that dynamic. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. There were a lot of pieces in there.
So I think it does. And I think this really brings us back to the preface where you start with Obama's inauguration speech and this notion of bad apples. And someone like Elizabeth Holmes, had there been a greater chorus speaking their values, right, it would have intersected with what seemed to be values that were going off kilter. And I think that's really one of the powerful things about what you're offering. It's not about the lone voice, but it's about the many voices in the context of a community that can speak to their values to move forward. I'm going to ask several questions have queued up. I'm going to ask if you can respond in a super pithy way.
I'll try.
About sort of where you've been bringing this work outside of business school frameworks into other professions, and any insight or learning that you have there to offer.
Yeah, I'll say a few things, and then I just invite anyone who's curious about something in particular to reach out to me by email. But we've started to work with engineering education, some legal education, healthcare, nursing, medicine, the US military, the Australian police force. So we've worked with lots of different professions in different ways. There's books in the GVV book series about applying this to medicine or law or other fields. And we've also worked with organizations. So, it's especially in the field of engineering right now. I mean, all of those professions are businesses too, right? So a lot of stuff it carries across, and then there are particular challenges based on the kind of work you do.
Great. One final question before we move to thanks. What's next for Mary Gentile? I'm not sure you have any time. Is there some vision for your work, for yourself, either for where you want to take GVV or a new acronym that you're working on?
So it's a great question. I ask it all the time of myself. I guess there's a couple things. One thing is that increasingly I'm finding ways, what I'm trying to do is to get other people to take this further because they know things that I don't. So for example, currently I'm working with some folks in Ghana who are developing an online program it's going to be Pan-Africa, not just in Ghana, but it's an online program introducing GVV, but also introducing how you teach GVV. And they've created a group of about 8 or 9 GVV style case examples based on real situations. It's been fabulous working with them because it's just so cool to see them applied in a different context. I'm similarly working with some faculty in Ireland who have created what they're calling a community of practice. It's faculty in engineering, social work, humanities, and I believe nursing. And they're trying to create a set of resources to bring the GVV approach to their teaching. I've currently worked with the School of Engineering at UVA to adapt the MOOC. We have a MOOC through Coursera, and they've adapted it for engineering education. And it was piloted last fall quite successfully. So now we're hoping it will be made available free of charge through something called the Science and Technology Online Ethics Center, which is originally funded by the NSF and now based at UVA. So, you know, I'm trying to get other people to take this into worlds that I don't know, right? But I think that it could be useful, similarly with law, et cetera. The other thing that I think I'm hoping will happen, and it's just starting to happen, there's something called the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia. And the woman who runs it used to be at NYU and had brought me there to share GVV there. So she and I have been talking about ways to use the GVV approach in some of the work they're doing around trying to encourage a more constructive conversation around a lot of our core political values in this country. And so the first thing that has come out of that is there's a faculty in the Department of Education and Human Development who's creating a new course. I think she's calling it Democracy Dialogue or something like that, or Democracy Discourse. And we're talking about using GVV as sort of the framework for their capstone project. So I'd love to see GVV be helpful. I mean, coming full circle to the preface of the book and Obama's inaugural speech, I'd love to see it if it could be helpful in terms of creating a more constructive conversation in our sort of political community. So.
Wonderful. Well, I just can't thank you enough, and especially sort of hearing all the directions this is taking and all the work behind it. Right. I'm especially grateful that you had time for this conversation. Certainly
it was
qualified,
fun.
yeah, as one of the busiest persons I have had a conversation with in a long time. So thank you. Thank you. And to everyone else who joined us, I really appreciate it. Apologies, we didn't get to everyone's questions. Please join us next month at noon on February 28th for a conversation with physician and author of Why We Revolt, Victor Montori. So thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon. This has just been so much fun. I appreciate it. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.